morning, good afternoon, and indeed good evening to all of you. Thank you for joining us today for the first virtual session of PPP's Global Genomics Conference, which is going to focus on why it is important scientifically, morally, and ethically to improve diversity in global genomics. Since February 2020, PPP has been carrying out its global genomics programs of work. Phase 1 considered how to bring the benefit of genome sequencing to the world, and Phase 2 is currently ongoing and considers what we mean by equity of access and return in global genomics. This work was inspired by both PPP's UK-focused work, the most recent element of which was our Genomics Revolution report, which we launched last October, and by our work in partnership with the Diplomat magazine to convene discussions through the London diplomatic community. That series is called the World Economic Series. And by seeing the challenges and hearing about opportunities from multiple perspectives, this gave us the inspiration to launch our global genomics programs of work. Our work, therefore, has a kind of interesting diplomatic angle to it. And as we know, diplomacy has played a central role in genomics since the Human Genome Project, first articulated in 1998 by a special committee of the US National Academy of Science, and later adopted through a series of 5-year plans jointly prepared by the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Energy. Now, from the outset, the entire Human Genome Project was centered around 2 key principles. Firstly, by welcoming collaboration from any nation in an effort to move beyond borders and to benefit from diverse approaches. And secondly, by requiring that all human genome sequence information be freely available and publicly available within 24 hours of its assembly. International collaboration and open access data have therefore been cornerstones of genomics since inception. And yet, notwithstanding the vision articulated by President Bill Clinton in 2003, that we must ensure that new genome science and its benefits will be directed towards making life better for all citizens of the world, never just a privileged few, access to the benefits of genome sequencing are not available equally to all. And in part, that is driven by the fact that the data sets which exist do not reflect the diversity of the global population. This was at the heart of our work, to explore how this lack of diversity has the potential to exacerbate health inequalities that we know exist, and what steps need to be taken to address this. There is a myriad of interconnected issues that contribute to these challenges. And the purpose of our work was to convene a unique cohort of stakeholders and subject matter experts from a variety of jurisdictions to explore the key policy issues that need to be addressed. And our first Global Insights report, published in February, summarized the findings from those discussions. Now, to be clear, our intention is not to duplicate work carried out by other organizations, but to socialize that work to a wider audience. We intentionally created a platform for different voices and perspectives to be heard, uniquely bringing together academics, researchers, clinicians, ethicists, lawyers, international agencies, industry partners, and members of the diplomatic community, and from jurisdictions with developed genomics programs and ecosystems, and those at the very start of their journey, and also, importantly, from high and low and middle income countries. We did not lead with the science, but with policy. Which brings us to today and our Global Genomics Conference. We are grateful to our partners, Genomics England, LifeBit, Amazon Web Services, Illumina, Thermo Fisher Scientific, and the Wellcome Sanger Institute, who have enabled this conference to take place. As all of our previous discussions took place behind closed doors and under the Chatham House rule, we wanted to use this opportunity to open up our discussions on some of the key themes to a wider audience. And that's why it is so fantastic to have all of you here. I haven't had a chance to check who is here versus who registered, but this morning when I looked, we had about 470 registrants joining us from more than 52 jurisdictions. And I'm grateful to all of you for being here. We're going to be asking a series of questions of you. And in fact, Charlotte, do you want to put the first question up now? And please get involved. If you think there are, if you think there are questions that we should be asking, please also put those into the chat and we may be able to create a different poll. Now, to help us lead this particular discussion, I'm delighted to welcome our panel of experts who bring such extraordinary diversity of perspective and experience to these issues, And shortly, I will ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves. One point to note is that unfortunately, Jantina de Vries is not able to join us today as she's unwell, and we wish her a speedy recovery. Deliberately, this session is not solely about diversity of data, although without question, this is important, as we know, for example, that the reference genome currently excludes 10% of variants present in African populations, and greater diversity in the data set will lead to greater scientific understanding globally. However, our discussions have repeatedly drawn out the need for greater diversity in all aspects of the genomics ecosystem. Change will not simply be achieved by creating a more diverse database. There is a global need to change the collective mindset regarding diversity and the ecosystem within which research is conducted. This needs to encompass a range of areas, including groups such as this and their dialogues, peer reviews, review of funding grants, selection of cohorts and editorial boards, as well as building capacity locally. And of course, there are interrelated issues about having great diversity in the workforce and how that can be addressed. And so I ask of you, our audience, what does diversity mean to you? What changes do you want to see? What is your experiences of the challenge that you face? What good examples can you share of how you've sought to address these issues, and why do you think it's important? Please contribute your thoughts through the chat function. Now, before I turn to our speakers, just a couple of housekeeping points, if I may. Those who have joined our sessions before know that we like to have a good discussion, and we very much welcome different perspectives. As I said before, the work of PPP does not lead with the science or the technology of genomics, but focuses on matters of policy and ethics. We have created this platform for everyone to share their perspectives. They are all relevant and valuable. And so there are a couple of ways to get involved, either by raising your hand or by putting your comment into the chat function. And I will try to bring in as many of you as I can, although I'm sure, forgive me if I don't get to everybody. Could I also encourage you to keep your line muted unless you have been invited to contribute to the discussion? And so, without further ado, let me turn to our speakers and ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves before we delve into the details of this important topic. Dr. Ishmael from Genome Qatar, could I call upon you to contribute first, and then I'll move to the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, and really a pleasure to be with you here to discuss all this. So my name is Ishmael. I'm the director of Qatar Genome. Qatar Genome is a population large-scale project that was launched in 2015. The first genome was sequenced in 2015. We're now at just past the mark of 30,000 genomes, and we're heading for 100,000 of those, representing Qataris and also other ethnicities from all around the Middle East. We started by sequencing apparently healthy individuals through the Qatar Biobank, but now we're merging fully with the Qatar Biobank into something called Qatar Precision Medicine Institute, basically signaling the new direction the next 5 years, where we will be sequencing disease cohorts rather than apparently healthy population. Both of those phases are very important, again, for the reason that we are the reasons that we are going to discuss here, which is diversity and filling the gaps and bringing more pieces of this puzzle about for a better understanding of the whole, if you want, jigsaw of the human genome. Glad to be with you here this morning. Sorry.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Saeed. Katalina, could we call upon you next for a brief introduction?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Kate. I'm super excited to be here in an early morning in Canada. I'm Chief Scientific Officer at Genome Canada, and Genome Canada is a funding agency. We have been supporting genomics, the use of genomics in the last 20 years in Canada, not only in human health, but we do use genomics in many different sectors that are key drivers of the Canadian economy. We use genomics also in the agri-food sector here. We're supporting projects in that area, in environment, but in particular on human health. Again, we have been supporting genomics in the last 20 years. We have support many different disease areas, the application in particular for large-scale projects in rare diseases, in cancer. We have been working with other agencies at a national and international scale to drive the use of genomics and the implementation of precision health across the country. And as we will discuss, of course, later on, our very important priority now in the last years has been not just diversity, but equity and access of genomics. We'll be discussing more that, and more than focusing on just the numbers and the amount of sequences and genomes we have sequenced. We're trying to really focus on advancing the implementation and the use of genomics in the clinic. So very pleased to be here, Kate, and very much looking forward to the discussion today.
Perfect. Thank you, Katalina. Shegun, can I call upon you? It's lovely to see you. We had a great discussion in advance of this session. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. But if you'd like to just quickly introduce yourself, that would be terrific.
Thank you very much, Kate. Hi, everyone. My name is Shegun Fatuma. I'm an associate professor at the MRC Uganda and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where my research focus has been on genetic impacts of on non-communicable disease, particularly in African population. So my work has been focusing on the Uganda genome resource, where we have a biobank and we have a genome for about 7,000 people. And also currently partnering with organization in Nigeria and collecting, recruiting 100,000 people on what we call the Nigerian Genome Project, 100,000 people. And the last two years, we have already reached our target of getting 100,000 samples from about 300 diverse population in Nigeria. I'm also very involved in capacity building in Africa, training people on how to be capacity on analyzing genome in different populations in Africa. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Shegun. That's perfect. Maxine, or Dr. Maxine McIntosh, as it says on your little screen there. But Maxine, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Kate. And it's lovely to see 139 people want to spend 2 hours discussing genomic data diversity. That's very exciting. So my name is Maxine McIntosh. I run a program at Genomics England called Diverse Data. We're a fairly new program. We were only kind of born in the last sort of 6 to 9 months. And I'll talk a wee bit more about it a bit later in terms of exactly what we're looking to achieve. But based on the name, it's looking to improve the diversity of genomic data. I'm also heavily involved in 2 communities that are, I guess, of relevance to this audience. One is an organization called One Health Tech, which is a federated global organization of about 20,000 people looking to improve diversity and inclusion in health innovation, and also data science for health equity, which is really around how we kind of reposition all those people with fantastic skills in data science and kind of gear them towards questions of health equity rather than maybe optimizing Facebook ads, for example. And so it's lovely to be here, and I'm looking forward to chatting about all things data diversity.
Perfect. Thank you, Maxine. So before we encourage all the people in the audience to get involved, I thought it'd be useful for us to maybe just set this discussion in a little bit more context. And so I'm going to ask each of the speakers to sort of comment on 1 or 2 areas. Please, can I encourage you to share your thoughts through the chat function? There may be issues that you think are of, burning importance that we've not yet mentioned. So please, now is your opportunity to try and help shape the direction of these discussions. But before we get into that, Saeed, do you want to talk a little bit more about how Qatar Genome are contributing to this issue around global diversity? We've talked before through the Global Genomics program about some of the work and the approach that Qatar has taken, which I think it's really important for us to draw out here. But would you like to share your thoughts a little more widely?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Kate again. So yes, so as I said in my introduction, this is the first large-scale population, PopGen, if you want, population-based genome project in the Middle East. When I say the Middle East, I talk about a huge geographical area going all the way from the Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean, from Morocco to Iraq, and an estimate of 400 to 450 million people live there. It's one of the, geographically, again, it's a crossroad where basically a lot of interaction and mixing happened. But if you go into ancient human history, you'll find that the Middle East or the Arabian Peninsula is the first cradle of humanity in its journey out of Africa. So it's one of those places that are very important to understand the human genome. People from this area migrated to all corners of the world, and of course they kept coming back. So this pool of genomes is really very important, as it is the case with any geographical part of this world. We're not going to understand what it's all about unless we get representative data from all over the place. So at Qatar Genome, we've had the resources and we've had whether it's the funds or the human talent they're accumulating, and that was launched, as I said, 5-6 years ago. And we could have gone disease from the beginning, but we knew that there's plenty of background data that is needed. This is why we went for a PubGen project, and we've sequenced now enough of those and published a lot of the data, and a lot of it is on its way to be published in good journals. So basically, we are very happy, and we say that all the time, that we are filling a huge gap, not only on behalf of Qatar. Qatar is a small country, but it's representative of the whole Arabian Peninsula, and the expat community living in Qatar represents basically the wider Middle East. Qatar has a huge expat community here, representing, I don't know how many nationalities, but everyone is represented, and in good numbers for people from around the Middle East. So once we've sequenced enough Qataris, we've also realize that we have this responsibility on behalf of the whole region. And so we went and sequenced, again, as I said, representative genomes for people living in Qatar, but of Middle Eastern origin, as I said, from North Africa, Egypt, the Levant, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, the rest of the Middle East. And we are now in the process of analyzing this data to basically fill again this gap and play that role on behalf of the less privileged parts of our region. One extra thing that we are doing to contribute is not just producing the data, but we're also enabling research in the region in other ways. One of them is these what we call them PPMs, Path to Precision Medicine grants or awards. We created a grant scheme, a research grant scheme, basically where we encourage people from around the region to come and apply for funds and get access to the data we're producing. So we're not just doing that on their behalf, but we're also engaging them and basically funding them. Another thing we've done is basically to produce what we call we're actually working on that, and we hope we can do it. We can wrap that up before the end of the year. We're producing a microchip, a microarray, a gene array, where we basically put the summary of variants we've got representing this part of the world and make it available to the wider research community if they want to do their own projects. Those who cannot afford a $1,000 or less genome, they can do it with this chip they call the Pan-Arab array. That would cost them a fraction of that, $50 or so. So this is quickly what we are trying to do at Qatar Genome. And as you've rightfully said, Kate, it's not just the data and it's not just the science, it's so many other things. We've realized from the get-go that there's a huge lack in policy and regulations and ethics. And we knew that this will add a lot of work on our shoulders. So we're not just doing the science, but again, you can't do it without having that running in parallel. You need the guidelines, you need the policies, you need the ethics, you need the morals. So we again took that initiative to be proactive and try to basically approach those key people within the region who can basically do that in collaboration with us. And we have produced few documents that could help basically initiate a wider discussion of what does it mean, not only from a global perspective, but also from a regional perspective, because it's important for everyone to basically have his own say in this global discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Saeed. I think that you've started us off really well, because there are a lot of issues that are sort of interconnected. But certainly when we've been chairing the sort of global genomics programs of work, this idea that, you know, how do we stop everyone having to reinvent the wheel every time they're trying to do something, I think is really important. Shegun, can we come to you next, actually? I mean, look, we're starting off, like everyone hairs off in the direction of, you know, well, we've got to improve diversity, but maybe you could talk about what diversity means to you. And actually, when we spoke last week, I think you've got some really interesting insights to share in terms of the support that you've received and how that's translated to sort of being able to create greater capacity within Uganda. But we'd love to hear your perspective.
Thank you very much, Kate. So diversity, what it means to me is currently, I'll just give an example. So currently, I'm working on genetic determinants for kidney disease. There have been so many studies on kidney function in European population and other population. So the most recent one is that there's a GWAS, that's genetic association study of kidney function in 1 million people in other population. So in Africa, particularly in Uganda, so we recently published the first ever genetic association study of kidney function in 3,000 people. So when you compare 3,000 people with 1 million people, that is how I describe diversity. There is lack of diversity because we have just done 3,000 and compared to 1,000 people. So that is one. And when I talk about diversity, there's always need to think about inclusion. So for example, for journal editors, for reviewers and all that, because they are always very, they are used to seeing genetic association study in 1 million people, 500 people. So when it's 3,000, you find it difficult to publish your paper. So there's no consideration for novelty of what you are doing, that, oh, this is data has not been seen before and all that. So people are really keen about, oh, give us a genetic action study of 1 million people in African population, whereas we know that it's not possible. So that is how I define a lack of diversity. So according to my journey, which we published a paper recently in Nature Medicine, and we describe a bit of my journey, which I think is a good model to fill the gap in terms of diversity. So I was trained at the Shanghai Institute for my postdoc, and the training was very strategic and focused. Apart from building capacity to analyze data, I was also being trained to be a leader in the genomic landscape. So I did my training, and the last 3 or 4 years, I'm now leading the Uganda Genome Resource in Uganda. So I think that kind of training, it helps. And since I've been leading that, I'm currently training 3 postdoc and 4 PhD students in Uganda. I think that kind of training that is very strategic and focused will help, because if everybody get their training and they stay back in Cambridge or they stay back in Oxford, it's not going to help to narrow the current lack of diversity, because people tend to want to analyze the data from their own population. And that's what we published in that paper on a roadmap to increase diversity. So one of them is capacity. We have to build more capacity in population that are underrepresented, and African is very, very underrepresented. So currently we have only 1.1% of African genomic that is available. And that 1.1%, they are majorly people of African American. So what that means is that in continental Africa, we have very, very minute, about 0.something% of genomes from continental Africa that are being analyzed. So there is need for more to be done. And that is why we are focusing mainly on building capacity in African population.
Perfect. Thank you, I mean, I think that you raised some really interesting points there. This point that you've picked up on in terms of the size of the cohort with respect to the research paper that you published, and that being quite difficult to get published. It wasn't quite as straightforward because the data set was quite small. very interesting, and a perspective actually that we've not heard through our discussions to date. We've talked a lot about kind of greater research equity, and I don't know if anyone from the Sangha is here that could talk a little bit more about the work that they're doing, but I think it's really important, this whole concept of making sure that there's appropriate accreditation or authorship acknowledgement, and that it's not just, all the researchers who have access to all the latest technology that get the credits. There's we really do need to look at that. That's why when we talked about diversity, it's not just about the data set, it goes much beyond that. So thank you very much for sharing your insights there. Katalina, do you want to tell us a little bit more about some of the work that you've been doing? And I would include within that sort of the work at G2MC and your work in Latin America, but also with respect to what's actually happening in Canada. And I think that the Silent Genome project that's happening in Canada is a really interesting example. But Katalina, could we ask you to share your thoughts?
Absolutely, Kate. Well, as Shegun and Saeed mentioned, diversity, equity, diversity and inclusion in genomics is much more than just increasing representation in cohorts. It's really a holistic and really a systems challenge that we have, and that's the way we're trying to address that Genome Canada. So we are specifically looking not just at how diverse are the cohorts we are supporting and the genomes we are sequencing, but we're looking at who are we sequencing. So what are the PIs that are applying to our funding? How can we ensure we are supporting a diverse pool of PIs? Or how can we ensure our grants, our initiatives are really promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion at all levels? We are then also looking at the subject matter that people are studying. So are those cohorts really diverse? And on these, we have, as you mentioned, Kate, quite innovative project that is called the Silent Genomes Project. And the Silent Genomes Project was started 4 years ago, and it's a project working with Indigenous communities in Canada, focusing on rare diseases. And an important part of this is not that, the project is focusing, of course, on the implementation and use of genomics, but it's beyond just the use of genomics. It's focusing on the governance, on the ethical, on the legal aspects, on the informed consent, how we need to manage the data. The data with Indigenous communities has to be managed in a whole different way. We have to respect sovereignty of the data. So understanding that, opening this dialogue, and driving the project from the Indigenous communities. The leader of the project is a woman, surgeon, an Indigenous surgeon from Indigenous communities in Canada. And she is the one that is really taking this vision to apply that across Canada. It's not, it's started in one province in British Columbia, but it's of course now interacting with communities, Indigenous communities across the country. So that project is also connected with other initiatives with Indigenous communities in Australia, in New Zealand, and in the United States. So again, it's really a learning process, and we are all supporting that learning process and all learning together. Now, on G2MC, the Global Genomics Consortium, Global Genomic Medicine Consortium, we have been working in the last, I would say, 6 to 7 years to advance the implementation of genomics in emerging economies. So the very specific focus of G2MC is the emerging economies. And we have done conferences in South Africa, in Chile, and we have bring together a community of people, trainees, scientists, medical doctors that are interested and that are learning about genomics. We do a lot of work also on trainees and younger investigators to support the younger generations and ensure that these younger generations are really focusing on the diversity and inclusion. As I am originally from Latin America, from Colombia, I have been also working a lot with Colombia and other Latin American countries in advancing genomics. One example of these is the work we did during COVID. And as many of you, of course, know, COVID-19 gave us the opportunity to somewhat build capacity in genomics to advance genomic surveillance across different regions. And in particular, for regions in Africa and Latin America, the investments done and the advancements done during COVID-19 for pathogen surveillance are really opening doors for the use of genomics in many other sectors. So, of course, there remain many inequities. When we saw that Canada, Europe, the US, and had access to vaccines in a much faster way, had access to sequencing in a much faster way, could sequence, the UK was leading the pack, sequencing thousands and millions of genomes, whereas Africa and Latin America were struggling to get those genomes, to even get the consumables. But at least, you know, we started with these baby steps to build the capacity to really have also the vision that the implementation of genomics is a global challenge. It's not a challenge for the UK, it's not a challenge for Canada, it's a challenge for all of us. And again, we saw it so clear during COVID-19 that we need these technologies to benefit all of us, not just a few of us. So with that, Kate, I think we covered a little bit what I'm doing with Genome and with Genome Canada and our Silent Genomes project.
Brilliant, thank you, Katalina. And I think this point, and I'd be really interested to hear from the wider audience, whether these messages that we're hearing resonate with your own experience. Katalina is exactly right. You know, we have seen capacity being deployed in response to the pandemic. But are these, you know, what we talk about, is this like resonating with you? Are you seeing changes, more opportunities? Are there greater barriers now than there were before? So we'd be really interested in finding out sort of, you know, the lived experience. I think that you raised some really important points there, as always, Katalina. I'm sure that we'll come back to some of those. But Maxine, can I just call upon you? We know from the Global Genomics programs of work that we do that the UK is seen as kind of one of the world leaders in genomics, and the fact that, you know, Genomics England has a specific data diversity program, I think is really interesting. But maybe you could talk a little bit more about, you know, the approach and you know, what the next steps are and where you are in that journey, if we may ask you to do so.
I would love to, but at the same time, so many interesting points have been raised. I can't quite be bothered to do the pitch of the program. I want to answer all the questions and the topics that have been raised. But the how you define diversity one, I would love to see what the audience said, because you know, the decision you take on that has the capacity to be exceptionally exclusive, and will have knock-on effects. So yeah, I'd love to see what the answer to that one is. So as I mentioned, the Diverse Data Initiative was kind of incepted about a year ago, but it's kind of only really been up and running in the last few months as we've been kind of recruiting in members of the team. So the aim of the program is very much around reducing inequalities within genomic medicine. We have three main outcomes that we're looking to drive here. So one is around kind of the clinical care component, so better prognosis, diagnosis, treatment and care for diverse populations. Second, I'm going to be quite specifically not define what diverse populations mean here, because I think that would be a good conversation for later. Secondly is around more and better research with diverse populations. Everyone I'm here sure will agree that there just simply isn't enough. And thirdly, it's around earned and sustained trust of communities that to date have been really excluded. So we're doing this kind of via four main work streams. So even though data is the thing that links all of these work streams, we're hopefully kind of keeping it quite a broad and multifaceted and multifactorial program. So the first one is around research. So it's really how we kind of understand the gaps in our data. So what's driving differential outcomes? How can we stimulate more research on populations that maybe have been under-researched to date? The second work stream is around community engagement, and we're seeing this in twofold. So one is a kind of bottom-up approach. So how do we work with community groups to both increase kind of trust, awareness, and, you know, be it Genomics England or anyone for that matter who would want to go and work with some of these excluded populations, that they're slightly more receptive to, say, a precision medicine effort next time they get approached, maybe. But the other side of it is top-down. You know, it'd be wonderful if every company, institution, organization, academic group had a diverse data initiative of sorts their own. And I think that the kind of basic level of awareness and recognition and priority that this is on people's radar just isn't for us kind of high enough. So we want to work with the people who are running these major institutions and companies to put it on their radar so that in some way or another they're running their own kind of DD project. The third one is around data and sequencing. So that's for us both how we increase the depth and breadth of data on excluded populations. So we're mostly doing this via tailored sequencing efforts. So we're going to be sequencing about 20,000 genomes using a range of technologies, Oxford Nanopore and Illumina. But also that's kind of a drop in the ocean. I mean, 20,000 is good, you know, and you know, more is always better, but in the grand scheme of things, that's also not a lot. And actually, when you start to delve into these groups, you know, the sparsity of data, like if you want to link in additional contextual information, such as people's, you know, lifestyle, social determinants of health, their clinical data, all of that's quite important to build a really rich understanding of kind of patients and participants' lifestyles and environments, and actually what's driving outcomes. But also we're aware that we want to kind of make better use of the data that we already have. You know, there are other data sets out there. We're not facilitating access to them. We make it quite difficult to access lots of these data sets. But also we want to recognize that sequencing is quite expensive. It takes quite a long time. It, you know, requires trust of people. And there's lots we can do. You know, our background is in statistical machine learning. You know, there's lots we can do in statistical methods to deal with missing data, so that whilst we wait for these initiatives to get up and running, we can make the impact right now less bad by effectively creating like a statistical plaster over our data sets, which would at least like buy us time so patients right now coming to clinic can have you know, at least better faith that the insights they're receiving are you know, as accurate as their maybe European counterparts. And the last one, just because I'm like, you know, a sort of statsy data nerd, is the one I probably kind of am most interested in. So this is our tools, products and behaviors workstream. So this is basically how do we give practitioners, that's clinicians, researchers, people at GEL, people across the ecosystem, the practical solutions to make their work as equity enhancing as possible. Because actually it's kind of difficult to work with non-European genomes if you're not used to it. You kind of have to change your workflows, you have to change your pipelines, you have to change your analysis, you have to change your study designs. Like that's actually quite a lot to ask of maybe like a fairly junior researcher who already has quite a lot on their plate. So you want to make it too easy not to do, to use individuals of ancestrally diverse backgrounds, and also the appropriate tools for those. So those are both kind of technical tools. So that's kind of your latest reweighting algorithm that's kind of rebalance your samples, right down to kind of the non-technical tools. So we've developed a language toolkit, which helps people use the precise and accurate language when it comes to diversity. And because it turns out lots of people are a bit anxious that they're being inadvertently racist when they use the word kind of ethnicity or ancestry or global majority or minority. And actually we've just provided a bit of clarity about, you know, which ones are in vogue and which ones are not in vogue. So we're hoping to kind of provide that kind of full range of technical to non-technical so that people, you know, actually have things that they can implement themselves. So yeah, that's the diverse data program. We big ambitions, and I said we're only like sort of 6 to 9 months in, so these are at the moment mostly ambitions. We've got some kind of early partnerships up and running, but it's very exciting, and it's a joy to be in the world of genomics, having very much existed the phenotypic level up to date.
Brilliant, thank you, Maxine. And I think the fact that this is a specific focus and you know, the reasons for that, and you know, why people, you know, maybe do or do not want to engage in this. And I wonder whether in the UK there are sort of a certain, you know, reticence to get involved. What does it say about kind of, you know, a variety of communities in terms of whether or not they want to contribute? I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that. Shegun, when we were talking last week, I think you had some quite interesting perspectives on that, you know, in terms of the experience in the UK versus what you're seeing in Nigeria and Uganda. Do you want to share your thoughts on that?
Sure, thank you, Kate. In Nigeria, I give an example that in the last 2 years, we have collected 100,000 sample in a biobank, and now currently doing genotyping and also doing whole genome sequencing. That was an excellent experience. People were willing to participate in the research. But when you come to UK Biobank, for example, where it's a biobank of 500,000 people, 500,000 people, you have only about 7,000 African ancestry individuals in UK Biobank. And what you will hear from people that lead the study is that people from African or people from Asian are not willing to participate in research in UK Biobank. I think the question we should ask is why? Because if people are willing to participate in their own country, in Nigeria, in Uganda, and Africa, and also maybe in Qatar or other part of the world, so why are they not willing to participate when they come to in the UK Biobank? And this is very similar to the experience that we had in terms of COVID vaccination. So you see that people from African ancestry individual, Asian individual are not willing to take the vaccination. So the question again is why? I think there are some fundamental things to address than just whether people are willing to participate or not. Maybe one thing to address is the workforce. Maybe if you have some people that are also people of African ancestry that are also leading the study, maybe they'll be willing to participate. Maybe if they see people that are of the same color like them are also leading in vaccination, maybe they'll be willing to participate. So that's my thought on that.
Perfect, thank you, Shegun. And I think that you raised some interesting points there. I'm sure that other people will want to contribute their thoughts. Certainly the parallels between participation genomics and the vaccine hesitancy work, particularly in the UK, I think is quite interesting, and that's come up in our discussions before. And also I know sort of other things that have been mentioned, how can, organizations such as Genomics England or the UK Biobank, if they have a sufficient diversity of their data, enable that data to be made available for the benefit of research in the country of original heritage. And I think that that's an interesting point. Now, Craig Davison, you've contributed to the chat, which is always welcome. And I would love it if we could call upon you to ask your questions of the speakers and actually the audience more generally. Although we are delighted to have Saeed and Katalina and Maxine and Shegun here, this is not solely a discussion where we just ask them a whole lot of questions, although that will be nice. It's about an opportunity for us to all share our thoughts and our experiences. And actually, I think that this, what do we mean by diversity is a really important point. And I think that Kai put in the chat, if I can find it, there's quite a lot of chat going, which is this point about inclusion for all, leaving no one behind, and access to treatment and healthcare. And I think there's an important point that comes through our discussion sometimes, that this can be presented as a bit of an issue just for low and middle income countries. I don't actually think that's correct, frankly. And I think putting everything through the lens of something being just an issue to be addressed in low and middle income countries is kind of missing the point. But Craig, where are you?
Hello, yes, I'm here.
Here he is. Craig, we'd be delighted if you wanted to ask your questions.
Yeah, so thank you very much. So I've loved all the work that the speakers have mentioned so far in the Middle East and Africa. I kind of just have two general questions. It's great that these new data sets are being collected in these underrepresented populations, and I'm really excited to see what research comes out of that. But how do you plan to share that data to researchers around the world? And also, if you could comment just some of your thoughts on the potential of no code required platforms for data analysis. So as someone who is not very good at coding myself, it's really nice when you get platforms that you can analyze data without needing coding experience. And I know a lot of research groups, especially research groups in underfunded areas, don't necessarily have a skilled bioinformatician in their team. So I was just wondering if you could comment on your thoughts of a potential no coding interface, which would then sort of democratize not just the access to the data, but also the ability to analyze the data.
Perfect. Thank you, Craig. I mean, I would pause if we couldn't get into too much of a discussion about coding, that would be preferable. But I think that what we're talking about here is, okay, we're going to create data sets. How do we make sure that those data sets can be accessed? And I think Julia Wilson is on here. She'll be cursing me now. But the Sangha have done some really interesting work around this area. And I know from a Genomics England perspective, this concept of accessible data, not just creating data that two people can look at, the whole concept of the advancement of genomics globally is that data sets will be created that are interoperable, and the work of GA4GH is essential in this regard about the standards to be applied for genomic data. But who would like to go first in a response to Craig? If we could avoid the detail of coding, I would be appreciative. Maxine, then Katalina, thank you.
Also seen Julia make herself visible, so I'm sure she's got something to add as well. So Craig, love your questions. I think they're really, really good questions. I think, I'm still fairly new to the world of genomics. So a lot of this more comes from a like electronic health record background, but there's DARE UK, which is really about pushing away from data ever being moved from its source and facilitating federated data access. And I think that's much more where we should be moving towards, rather than expecting the data gets shared across regions. I really don't think we need to do that. There's all sorts of discussions around which trusted research environment wins and want to rule them all. But I think we should really move away from saying we have to have data sloshing around different systems, moving across jurisdictions, because that just doesn't feel that's where we need to go. So DARE UK is the one that we're particularly interested in. I think it'd be fantastic if the first research questions running on DARE UK was about equity. It's wonderful to have testing and validation sets across different data sources. It starts to get a bit trickier though when lots of people will hear and understand and think that genomic information is largely useful when you link it, especially to clinical and phenotypic data, and that has huge heterogeneity across regions, let alone across countries. Even within the UK, I'd like to see better data sharing, but the fact that we can link to medical records is a huge benefit. But once you start to look across different countries, then it does slightly, I think, provide challenge the sorts of questions you can ask when you don't have that longitudinal data linkage that's consistent in a way that is also adhering to EHR national standards. On the coding point, or non-coding platform, I couldn't agree more. So I know that Gel is looking at point and click solutions for exactly that reason. Kate, I'm not going to talk about coding, but one of the things that we're going to be watertight on for our workstream platform is absolutely our products platform, sorry, is that every single tool or product that gets uploaded has to sit under the MIT open source license, which is a kind of slightly different answer to your question, but it means that everything there is publicly available. The source code is publicly available. It's all on GitHub and it's all viewable, because the moment you do that, you make it much easier to collaborate globally and also make things better, make things more locally appropriate. And so I think that no code is one solution, but also just making code and like the machinery behind solutions publicly available and editable is another way to address it. And that's definitely one that we'll be taking.
Perfect. Thank you, Maxine. So Craig, I hope you're, I hope that you're going to come along to our session tomorrow, which is on the utilization of technology to address science inequity. And I think the points that you raised there are really important in that context. And I see that Nikki Murphy has put into the chat this concept of securing data at source rather than moving it around is really important. That's something we've talked about quite a lot in our global genomics programs of work. Actually, the phrase data sharing is quite problematic. I don't think that we really mean data sharing. We mean accessibility of data. And actually, Peter Goodhand has a very good phrase for it, which is we should regard it as data stewardship, and how we look after the data so that it can be accessible. And that there's also an important point, which I think will come up tomorrow, which is at the moment, who can access and analyze this data? Is it too narrow a set of people? Do we need to expand that? So that's something useful. Katalina, Shegun, and Julia Wilson has beautifully put up her hand as well, whether she wants to or not. Katalina, your thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Kate, and really good points, Craig. And I'll just want to bring two examples of the work we did during, again, COVID-19 in genomics with the Canadian COVID Genomics Network. And in that, we had actually two kind of distinct examples. One was the viral genome sequencing data across the world. As I mentioned, with COVID-19, we built capacity across the world in many African and Latin American countries. And in that case, Kate, actually, we were moving data around, which is challenging, and for all that represents, we were really sharing those small genomes, those 30,000 letter genomes of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and most of them were going to a centralized database called GSED, where different countries were sharing the data and people could access. And then the challenge we had in many countries, in particular emerging economies, was that data was submitted, but there was no capacity to use all the data that was available because of the lack of bioinformaticians, the lack of computational biologists, and the lack of capacity overall to do the analysis of the data. So you submit your data for the global good, and you're not able to benefit back from that submission of the data. That was a huge, huge global challenge. And on the human side, in Canada, we were also, as the UK, we were also sequencing human genomes, and we did that on a federated model, as we say, not sharing physically the data, not moving data around at all, but keeping the data in each of the sites where they were sequenced and connecting that data, making sure the data is accessible. And as you mentioned, Kate, bringing that concept of stewardship and the concept of harmonizing, standardizing the data and making that data easy to use and easy to access. And I think that at a global level is what we should aim with organizations like Global Alliance, like G2MC, that are pushing for that global use and global access of genomic data across the world. And I will finish by saying that as part of Cancogen, I would say naively, we had a target of sequencing and having at least 5% of the genomes from indigenous communities, because it's around 5 to 10%, 5% of the population in Canada that's represented by indigenous communities. And that's what we were targeting. When we approach indigenous communities to get included in the human part of the COVID-19 human genome sequence, they were not able to participate because our informed consent were not conceived for data sovereignty. So we actually conceived the project in a way that is really from the get-go not very inclusive. So I think there's so many aspects we need to think when we conceive the informed consent, when we conceive the structure of the data, how the data will be accessed or not. All these in the spirit of diversity has to be thinking a different, completely different way.
Perfect. Thank you, Katalina. Shegun, when you've done your work in Uganda, your data is all accessible, isn't it? Do you want to tell us a bit more about that and the rationale for that?
Yeah, that's correct. And our data is accessible. Just to say before that, it took us 10 years to generate that data from 2010 to 2020. And we made that data available on EGA. So what that means is that anybody that is interested to analyze that data, just tell us what they want to use that data for, and they can get the data and use the data. I think that's the best practice. So we made the individual level data set available. Apart from that, because data are into different levels, there's also the GWAS summary statistics, which we have analyzed about 50 phenotypes, and we made all the GWAS summary statistics available on GWAS catalog. So that means people that want to do meta-analysis can go there and just download for free. We have also been doing genetic risk score, and we also made that data available on the PRS catalog for people to use. So that's the best practice. I would like to encourage anyone that is building a biobank to think about others also and make their data available. But I must mention that one key factor is that genomic data, there's need for consideration for ethics. Many times, if the ethics does not allow, it might be impossible to make some data available, particularly in underrepresented population. But in our case, we have ethics that allow us to make that data available, and we made them available. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Shegun. Julia, from the Wellcome Sanger Institute.
Thank you, Kate. This is a really great discussion already, and I've got so many bits to add, but so most of us adhere by the FAIR principles for data, which is making sure data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I think most researchers have that at least in the back of their mind at some time. And I think there's a role for funders here to mandate sharing of data, which by Wellcome as our funders, which means that our data is accessible, our research data, I should say, is readily accessible for others. And we do use the tools and standards and the principles from the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, which I know will come later in this series, and they provide a toolkit for the community to ensure that we can retool as a community and our data is interoperable and can be shared, not necessarily shared, but federated. So you take your kit, you take your compute to the data, and we can federate different data sets and amplify their meaning. Obviously, this is about equitable, equity and diversity. So as I've said, all of our data is accessible to the community, and we've actually looked to see globally who is accessing our data, and we realize there are geographical differences in who can access or who is accessing that data. And we looked into the reasons why, and it can be to do with sort of having access to high performance computing, can be due to having access to an institutional recognizable email address, things that we hadn't considered. So we are looking at this, with our training, capacity building, equitable collaboration work as well. But as Katalina indicated, the pandemic was a great example of where data sharing was paramount. The 2 million genomes that we sequenced at Sangir was really important, and to make real-time health decisions in the UK about lockdowns and about new variants that were being detected in the moment. So I think we've demonstrated how crucial it is to have this infrastructure by which we can make data accessible to others to access, because it's not necessarily just us who needs to access that data and make decisions on it. So thank you.
Perfect, thank you, Julie. And I think this concept, the role of genomics through the pandemic, I think is, given a terrific platform globally for a greater understanding of the potential for genomics, and that whole intersection between public health and policy, which is much heavily informed by the science of genomics. And so the question now is how do we take this forward into the next level, if you like? Because one theme that came through our discussions in Global Genomics was if there wasn't greater equity of return with respect to participation in genomics, would we see a situation where we saw more nationalistic tendencies coming in from policymakers? And would that impede the progress of global genomics? Because data sets either would exist or be created which were not deliberately not made accessible, so that somehow policymakers would perceive a value in that data set that went beyond what the kind of accessibility of that data set could contribute to genomics globally. Look, we've got another poll. We're awash with polls, so please do contribute your thoughts. Dr. Saeed.
Yes, thank you very much, Kate. So I'll just go back to the last point Julia mentioned, and Katalina as well a moment ago, which is how important what we've all seen happening during the COVID, the pandemic, and there's so many lessons that can be learned. But I'll just highlight on an angle, which is when we talk about the importance of diversity in genomic research, it's not just the direct impact out of that, which is to understand what variants are here or there affecting this or that disease. It's all about, it's a lot of other things. And one of them is the capacity building, whether it's infrastructure or the talent pool, as they say around that. So when you invest in, this is for the privileged countries, for the companies who got the money, the tech ones and all that. If you invest in those infrastructures working around genomics, it's the same technology and infrastructure and talent that will be very useful in cases like COVID-19. And we've all known that it is very important that, for example, viral sequencing for new variants should be coming very accurately and promptly from all around the world for us all to be safe. So this was one very important example when diversity is basically actually can affect you directly in another place. I mean, if you don't build enough infrastructures and talents. This is the future. We all know, we all say in our lectures and seminars that precision medicine, genomic medicine is the future, but that is basically dependent on that infrastructure point that I've been talking about now, which is the technology and the talent. When we face things that are more urgent, like the COVID, we discover how important it is to invest in those things around the world. And we've just witnessed that in Qatar. I mean, we started building the infrastructure in 2014, 13, 14, and then we were ready to start sequencing the first genomes in 2015. We brought all the talent and in addition to the infrastructure. And then when COVID came upon us in 2020, we could very quickly contribute to the global sort of effort to combat the pandemic. And suddenly we discovered that some of the best, some of the world first papers regarding the efficacy of this vaccine or that vaccine towards this or that variant are coming actually from Qatar. New England Journal of Medicine, Nature, Lancet, and all that. We discovered, oh, we can contribute. And why was that possible? Because we have the infrastructure, we have the talent. So it's not just about genomic research. It's also about precision medicine as well. It's also about so many other things. And COVID was the great example to show how important is that. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Saeed. I mean, look, we could do a whole 2 hours on pathogen surveillance and pandemic preparedness and the lessons that we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic. And was there equitable return for contribution? I would say probably not. Anyway, but that's a whole topic that we could go into, and we have a different session about that on Wednesday. Kai, you put a point in the chat earlier about what diversity means to you, and I'd really like us to go back to that, if you would be willing to ask your question. They might have gone away.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, Kai, there you are.
Yeah, so the reason why I put that response in, which is that essentially diversity is about everybody and leaving nobody behind, is quite straightforward in terms of it involves all of us that inhabit the planet. All of us should have human rights and should benefit from the great work that's being done by the various people that are here and around the world in terms of genomics. And oftentimes when we discuss diversity, we are entirely aware that there are some people that are left behind, and that should never be the case. And when I joined the issues where we're covering things like COVID, you can see how you can have one country that's barely had 2% of the vaccination of the population vaccinated, and you have other nations that have people vaccinated 4 times over. So it's very important that that is one of the lessons we learned from COVID, and that should be central to the discussion relating to diversity and the barriers to it, that nobody gets left behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. I think that's a really interesting point, this concept of what do we mean, meaning no one's left behind. And I think on a global, look, we just haven't got this right. No jurisdiction has got this right. So again, I come back to my point that this is not, just an issue for low and middle income countries. I think sometimes the focus seems to be put on it being a problem for low and middle income countries, which I find a bit the wrong way around, to be honest. But anyway, Maxine, your thoughts on that point before I choose someone else to get involved.
Yeah, no, thanks, Kai. So I totally get the sentiment behind that, but actually the moment we push that decision in terms of you've got a finite resource, finite time, you've got to make decisions and you've got to allocate resources against those decisions, that becomes practically unfeasible and impossible to operationalize. And so whilst I get the notion of no one to be left behind, that practically doesn't really work. And I think that's one of the things that makes the discussion about what diversity is very tricky, because if we discuss it at a global level, in the UK, we can wash our hands. We can say, well, we're representative of the UK population, so that's all good. And if we do it at the UK level, then questions about who's underrepresented mean very, very different things. So are we talking about protected characteristics? Are we talking about ethnicity? Are we talking about any factors that what axes drive the biggest differential outcomes? If it happened to be that, you know, you did a principal and component analysis and it was that people who play bingo on Wednesdays is the thing that describes the biggest variation, then do you go and sequence people who play bingo on a Wednesday? I'm being a bit facetious, but the challenge about actually how do you precisely and accurately define who's underrepresented, I think is a thing that without describing the lens or deciding the lens and the framing of what we do and what importantly, what values you want to optimize for, I think is really tricky. So for example, at Genomics England, we had a very, very long and workshopped discussion over many months about is the outcome we're looking to achieve representativeness? Is it about cost effectiveness? Is it about discoverability? Because you can't diversify without an outcome of interest, because diversification is dependent on having an outcome you're trying to diversify against. And so that is a problem if you're trying to create a general diverse data set, or you can assume that you can never diversify enough and therefore you should just have the best whack at creating the most diverse groups in different ways. So without like framing it in terms of local, global, national, regional, and the value sets you describe and you put behind what a diversity metric and axis and factor is, then I think we actually have very, very different conversations at the same time. And those things are going to be driven by the values of the organizations, by the values of people, by the values of the company. There's not like a wrong or right answer, but we all are all having very different conversations.
No, thank you, Maxine. I think, yeah, we of course did a different program of work with Genomics England and Welcome Connecting Science around socializing the genome in the UK. And this concept of the hard to reach community, I mean, I understand that, but the more I think about it, the more I'm wondering whether we're just putting the onus in the wrong place. Now, Mavis just put her hand up, and then in the flash of an eye, once I turned and looked out the window, she's taken it down again. But I'm going to take that Mavis actually wants to contribute, whether she's put her hand up or not. Mavis, we'd love to hear your perspective.
And it's been really good listening to everyone else speak about this. I think what this shows is actually the concept of diversity in genomics is so varied, right? One of the things that I think we shouldn't move away from is the kind of role of genomics within a global society. Because yes, we can kind of go, well, okay, we've got these Middle Eastern genes, we've got African genes, we've got genes representing the UK population, but none of those people participating in whether it's clinical studies or research studies exist just as individuals within those geographical spaces. So each one of us is always going to have some connection with people outside of a geographical location. So it's thinking about, you know, like Maxine saying, what exactly are we trying to achieve? One of the things that I think is probably helpful is moving away from economic metrics. While of course these are scarce resources, we also have to think about the social justice agenda. And a lot of people get missed from kind of those discussions about what are we actually trying to achieve. It can be about health, but how are we maximizing that? And I think maybe we need to bring in the humanities in these regards when we think about kind of the biological outputs and the health outcomes of people. But it's also thinking about, well, okay, if we're talking about genomics from the perspective of X, what does that participation look like? What are the things that are most important to those people? Because we might actually all be congregating to a particular, say, I don't know, outcome, but the person who's determining the importance of that outcome might not be aligned with the people participating and congregating around that. What I mean by this is, you know, Shegun has been talking about work that African researchers have been doing. These might not necessarily be the same questions that people on the global scale, I say global kind of outside of Africa, are thinking of. So when we are talking about genomics, it's also about, well, who's asking the questions, what questions are being asked? And we know that people in different countries have different health burdens. So how are we even bringing those perspectives into the discussions around diversity? So just kind of thoughts out there, but I think it's beyond just kind of, you know, the economic perspective, but thinking more about social justice on a global scale and equity in that regard.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think one of the themes that comes out is how actually we frame genomics. And so just framing genomics is, oh, it's going to help us cure rare disease and create a, you know, personalized medicine. that all sounds like a bit of a luxury, to be perfectly honest. And actually, if you are in a jurisdiction where you've got bigger fish to fry, that is just like turning people away, because it just sounds like something that's massively expensive and will benefit one or two people, whereas actually that's not what we mean. And actually, exactly as you're saying, Maeve, we have to understand what it is that people want, because actually not everyone wants the same thing, and just everyone sort of seemingly being expected to, you know, contribute because it's in the public good. Is that the answer for everybody? Do we all see that in the same way? I'm not sure that we do, from some of the discussions that we've been having. And I think it's important that we recognize that, how we tackle that. You know, this is all about public trust and engagement, which is obviously, there's another topic we could do, you know, days on. Thank you, Mavis, that was really helpful. Katalina, and then Shegun, I think that you've probably got some interesting perspectives in terms of how you're approaching, you know, this impact and, you know, the potential outcomes of having this. But Katalina.
Yeah, Kate, I just wanted to comment a little bit on what the great point that Mavis made, and just share that at Genome Canada, some of you that know Genome Canada, we have been historically, when we fund large-scale projects, we always include a component of what we call the GELs, which is all the ethical, environmental, economical, legal, and social aspects of genomics. So there's always that component of genomics and society. And we are now moving from adding that component of looking at the social and economic impact of genomics to moving towards more of a co-creation model, which is what Mavis was saying. Just instead of us saying, okay, here I am, the scientist in Canada that is trying to think how to solve challenges in Africa or in Latin America, and how we can implement and use genomics in emerging economies or in regions, is really co-create that. And I think the Silent Genomes Project was one of those first examples where we are co-creating. We're just leading the project from within the indigenous communities. So is really understanding those needs in a much more holistic way, as opposed to bringing solutions or bringing technologies and pushing the technology. And again, Kate, I think we saw it clearly, and we, as you mentioned, we'll talk more about pathogen and COVID and all these in other sessions. But I think the COVID-19 was, again, a good example on how some countries were helping with the data production and helping with the co-creation in a certain fashion, but also was a clear example of all the challenges, opening really to, bringing to the open all the challenges we have around equity, diversity, and inclusion. But I really thank you for your point, Mavis, because I think the co-creation and really working together and bringing that social justice and bringing those social aspects to the forefront of what we do, more than focusing on the economic benefits that, and I said also, as a funding agency, we get a lot of pressure to show the economic benefits of genomics, how much return on investment, how much jobs are we creating, how much, so a lot of the metrics are on economics when we are investing in technology, as opposed to what are those social benefits, what is the economic, the social justice, and really the ethical use of this technology. So great point.
Thank you, Katalina. Yeah, I could plug another one of our sessions on Thursdays, how to articulate the economic benefits of genomics. And actually, Rob Annan, the CEO of Genome Canada, will be contributing to that, along with Manop. I don't know if Manop's still here, but we'd always love to have the perspective from Thailand. Professor Sir Mark Caulfield and Ilse Custers from the European 1 million plus genome project. And in fact, I've seen Annemieke been contributing through the chat function, so we might actually come to you in a second. But Yewande, you've put your hand up, which I always love. We would love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, I just want to kind of summarize really what Mavis and Katalina said, because I was formulating my ideas as I was saying. And I think it's quite important, although Katalina mentioned co-creation, that co-creation and social equity has to be part of the discussion at the beginning in the research design, and that doesn't happen. So, and also that needs to reflect capacity building and also the diversity and the power dynamics, because mostly you have people from the global north or sitting down and writing these bids and creating the pathway, and then it seems like the global south or people racialized as Black in diaspora in Britain, Canada, and Europe are like an afterthought. So I call this kind of the essay and the footnote. So we need to remove these questions of social justice from the footnotes to really a part of the essay. And it's kind of borrowing from this systems analysis or systemic approach, holistic approach, where we have scientists, humanities, both global north, global south coming together at the beginning to really co-create. So you can't co-create midway or after. You need to co-create, and the questions that we're asking to have actually a real diverse opinion for diverse people, not just selected gatekeepers from certain communities. So I think that is one of the flaws in the system in a lot of ways that we construct things.
Thank you, Wanda. I could see, look, he's smiling and he's nodding, so I'm going to ask him what he thinks in a second. I think that you raised some really interesting and important points there, and this concept of us considering from the outset, not halfway through, what we want to achieve is something that has actually come out very strongly through our more recent discussions about equity of return, or what we might call benefit sharing, which may be monetary and it may be in other fashions. But this whole idea, and there's an interesting point that I would just like to throw in there. I think that there is an important role of the private sector to play in all of these discussions. And that is to work out how the private sector can contribute, profit-making organizations working in partnership with research communities and public initiatives. What is the role of the private sector in helping to enable some of this to happen? And again, what I would say with that, I think that Genome Canada have thought long and hard about this through their new approach to their funding strategy. You can't leave that thought until the end. When the data has been created and somebody wants to access it and they then go off and do something, there seems to be a lot of solidarity of approach at the data collection end of the spectrum, and it kind of falls off a cliff a bit when you get to the interface with profit-making organizations. And I think that's because it hasn't been plugged in at the beginning. So Wanda, I think that you raised some really important and excellent points. I'd really like to tease those out. So Shegun, if we may come to you, because I could see you smiling and nodding, and then Kai will come to you, and then Katalina will come to you. But please, I think this is a really important area, so I encourage all of you to share your thoughts through the chat function. All of that will be captured for our kind of evidence base. But Shegun.
Thank you very much. I think Wanda, she's right. Most of what we see now is mainly afterthoughts. And I would like to make this point very strongly. If we collect the genomic data from, say, 500 million people in one population, it will be useless for all population. So it's compulsory that every population is represented. And I'll give an example. There is a drug that was discovered from a gene called PCSK9. So this drug is to lower the bad cholesterol, which is a risk factor for heart attack. So this drug was discovered because some African ancestry people were involved in a research, and they saw that there's a gene in them that was helping to lower the bad cholesterol. So that's just one good example of why all population must be represented in genomics for precision medicine. Because if those African ancestry individuals have not been included in that study, we will not have that drug for lowering cholesterol now. So if we keep on getting more data from just one population, that data set, it will be useless for all population. in terms of precision medicine. So we have to have that in mind, that all population must be represented. And I like the point you made about partnership. Maybe one of the reasons why one population is having more data set, more funding, is because there is responsibility from the government, responsibility from their government, responsibility from a private organization in their country. And in many low-income countries, particularly in African countries, some government, I'm saying this, I'm sorry to say this, but government in many African countries are irresponsible and don't take research serious. So that is why we in Nigeria, we are now partnering with a company, with a private company called 54Gene, collecting 100,000 samples in Nigeria, because that is the way to go. If you look at all those big initiatives all over the world that have been very successful, such as the UK Biobank, all of us in the US, the China program on genomics, all of them, they have this private organization supporting them. And I think that is the way to go for underrepresented population, to partner with a private organization and build their own genome initiative.
Thank you, Shegun. This concept of partnering with the private sector, what always comes back in these discussions is mistrust. Always, always, always mistrust, like a lack of a balance of power. And I think that there's something that needs to be considered around that, because what I find quite surprising as a sort of objective bystander here is that everyone seems to have to start right over every time in a discussion with a potential private sector partner. And the private sector potential partners say, well, we want to help, but we don't know how to. And they shouldn't be kind of like rolling up and sort of flogging their wares to a national, genomics initiative. But how did Ambrose come up with a number of $450 million a year for a decade to do the 3 million African genomes project? Did he discuss that with anyone in the private sector? There could be other ways to do it. We know of the work that Illumina or Amazon Web Services do. Should actually it not just be seen as a philanthropic donation? Should this be something that as a commercial strategy, players in this field should be considering how they can better support certain initiatives? We're going way off topic now, but that's another little favorite of mine. Kai, you faithfully had your hand up. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and then we're going to go to Katalina.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank the attendees for their support of the point that I made. I echo Shegun's point. The reason why I made the point that I made is because I know that of the 127 cell and gene therapy trials and the research on Catapult, none relate to conditions that predominantly affect people of color. And so it's really important that we understand these facts. We can make assessments of the data, but the material issue is the way in which it engages and involves us all. In terms of the issues of the commercial aspects, one of the things that we did on the Olympics, so my background is I advise multinational organizations on corporate sustainability in its reporting, transparency and disclosure. And so what we did during the 2012 Olympic Games was to make sure that invitations to negotiate had qualifications for sustainability. And I think commercially, this should be a requirement for anybody that is seeking funding for trials and research. They should be able to evidence that they have a representative group involved in the design, and also going forward, how they've designed it to involve people so that we do get a greater diversity, whether that's gender, whether it's other protected characteristics, however suits the circumstance of that particular piece of research. And I've put a note inside the chat as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. And I think that the bit that you've missed off there, was leadership and accountability. I think this is really, really interesting, because you can have as many initiatives as you like, but if there's no accountability for whether or not it's achieved, it sounds like a bit pointless. And I think that that's really, how do we make, you know, these things kind of more accountable? How does that manifest itself? How can we evaluate, you know, what happens? What are we going to do with the data? I know that Segura's on the line, and, you know, in certain pockets of, you know, the population in the UK, actually data has been collected, which is actually very representative. But the question then is, what are we going to do with it? And that's a kind of a secondary point to, oh, let's get a, you know, greater diversity in the data. But then actually, what are we going to do with the data once we've got it? Are we going to equally utilize that data to drive positive health outcomes for all the elements of the population? I think that's quite an interesting point. It's not going to be corrected simply by having more diverse data if we're not prepared to do stuff with that data.
Kate, I put in the chat, I put leadership and accountability in the chat because it is absolutely central, and strategy. You can have all the data you require in the world, but unless you have people that know what to do with the assessments, then nothing really happens. So as I always say, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. If you can't manage it, then you can't change anything. We are all here about change, okay? This is what getting diversity into genomics is all about. It's not there yet, otherwise this conversation wouldn't be taking place.
100%, which is why conversations like this are so important. And, you know, I'm not patting ourselves on the back about it because, you know, more and more conversations are required, but at least we're hopefully drawing out some key themes. Katalina, let's have your input.
Yes, thank you, Kate. And well, totally agree. And you know what is interesting is the shift that we're seeing now in the last 5 years with private sector industry are more and more thinking about bringing this diversity. But as we have said here, well, you know, we're initially happy seeing that some of these very large companies, without naming names here, but some of these companies were around the world offering free sequencing for some underrepresented populations. And we actually had discussions with one of those companies and our indigenous communities here as part of the Silent Genomes project. And of course, very quickly, we came to the conclusion that this free sequencing, of course, there's no free lunch. This free sequencing is, of course, we generate the sequence, but we somewhat keep access to the data, and we somewhat, so I think is really how these projects are conceived and how the involvement of the private sector is conceived, I think has to be rethink. It's not about, as we have said, it's not about generating the data. I think even though there's big limitations in the access to technology and access to capacity and infrastructure in emerging economies in Africa and Latin America, and all these regions will welcome support from the private sector to get equipment, to get the data, to all that's necessary and is important. But is, as we say, is really who is benefiting from that data at the end of the day, who will get access to the data, but who making the whole circle. If we develop a new drug, if we develop a new biomarker based on that data, who at the end of the day will benefit from that drug? Who at the end of the day will benefit from that biomarker? And I think that thinking, I'm not sure it's totally embedded in the private sector yet. You know, there is, of course, the thinking on diversity, yes, I think that's more and more, but not the thinking of the access, the benefits, and the overall circle of what that diversity needs to bring. So a key component and a key call for the private sector to think about these differently.
Thank you. And I think that the whole interaction of all the elements, the ecosystem, I think is really important. Because unless we have all of these elements participating, then genomics is just going to become the preserve of those jurisdictions that can afford to fund it. That cannot be the answer. But I do think some really interesting insights came out of our last roundtable on global genomics about benefit sharing. And I don't know whether Sarah from Variant Bio is on the line, because actually they have the only example that we could find, and if other examples are available, please do share them, of an organization that had really thought this through from the outset all the way through. And I'm not saying that this is a perfect model or it's the only way, but to me that was really interesting, and actually also this concept of, you know, creating these data sets by pharma, you know, and then what happens? So yes, there were some interesting things that came through the discussion on the last roundtable. Maxine, and then Sagira.
Thanks, a really, really interesting conversation. I'm going to give an example of the traveller community, because often we kind of talk about kind of continental ancestry groups, but I think travellers is a really nice example in the UK. Between 15 and 30,000 travellers. They're vastly undocumented peoples, and huge degrees of homozygosity in the communities, because lots of kind of relative marriages. So from a kind of genetic diversity, hugely underrepresented, terrible outcomes, undocumented, very poor data on them, and you know, they're largely silent in the conversation around looking at genomic diversity. And I went to a really, really interesting conversation, which was hosted by a number of kind of key leaders in the traveller community. And it was really interesting where the apprehensions were on kind of who's doing what sequencing. And, you know, to cut a kind of long story short, I think one of the things that I really recognize is, for different communities and sub-communities within those communities, the balance of public sector or private sector really, really varies. The public sector has largely been behind some of the countries in the world's major eugenic programs. And that's really been public sector driven in the recent centuries. And so the apprehension, certainly in this conversation amongst the traveller community, was that there's significantly more distrust for the public sector than there was for the private sector. But you know, as many of the conversations we just had now, some people will feel visceral feelings towards profit-making organisations, you know, for good or bad reasons. So yeah, I guess it was just a point of different communities that are genetically underrepresented have different views, and I think that public sector, certainly in the case of genomics, because of recent abuses in certain eugenic programs, I think it makes it a lot less clear cut than kind of public sector good and private sector bad.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. It's not clear cut. And actually research organizations are responsible for a huge amount of mistrust, right? This whole concept of helicopter research, you know, in 2022, that can't be right. And a lot of mistrust, as evidence through our discussions, it is long-standing, and it's not specific to the field of genomics. It's built upon hundreds of years of mistrust, and actually, I can't see that could be even disputed, to be perfectly honest. I'm not showing examples, but yes, I mean, I think that the concept of, you know, public trust and how we communicate about genomics is really important. And it's not so straightforward, exactly as you say, that public sector is good, private sector is bad. There'll be plenty of jurisdictions around the world where no one is going to share their data with a publicly controlled organization. I'm not saying where they are, but there'll be lots of examples. And I think there's an interesting point, picking up on a point that Katalina has made, in terms of which communities or even jurisdictions seem to get more funding than others. I mean, I'd really welcome Manop's perspective of what's happened in Thailand and their approach to genomics, which has put it sort of more as an economic driver, more akin to the approach from Canada. But in Latin America, we've heard that, you know, the cost of sequencing, it's just more cost effective for countries to outsource their sequencing capacity or capabilities to other jurisdictions because the cost is too great. I mean, you know, there's a whole desert issue all by itself. Sagira, are you going to enlighten us with your thoughts, please?
Hi, everyone. Fascinating discussion on it's just so moving session, and all of us, like, we agree that there are clinical, moral, and scientific benefits of diversity. Without that, I can't see that unless our data sets truly reflect diversity, we going to fulfill our promise for global health for everyone, or to include everyone. So I think there's no doubt about that. There is absolutely no question about that. And Kate, you already highlighted that for me, I think even for those community, I know that, okay, once the data set for certain community, to some extent, where the data sets are reflective of something, what are we going to do that? How are we going to translate those findings into our clinical practice? For example, I am from Yorkshire Regional Genetic Service, for many who don't know me, and we have a huge, Pakistani population is our second ethnic group in this region. And we have seen increased risk of autosomal recessive genetic disorder because of their practice of consanguinity, cousin marriages. But recently we've done another research study where the born and Bradford data is coming into with the London Genomic Health Project. And though we have looked at that data from consanguinity point of view as well, and that was a population data we looked at, and we went back almost 70 generation or something, and this data has shown that it's not just the consanguinity, it's the marriage pattern within the community, like endogamy, which is the marriage pattern within the clan or within the social group, is also associated with increased risk of a recessive condition. Now my question is that what communication strategies, because that's very important data for us, of course, for science and to developing maybe multiple other clinical research projects and for pharmacogenomic project as well. But these findings are important for communities as well. And that we go back to those communities, and at the end of the day, we are not stopping their practice, but we are making them aware of that this is the finding of our research. It's a very sensitive topic. It's not an easy topic. And my debate would be that, okay, if that is an issue for Pakistani population, then isn't it same for our UK population from Hull or from Grimsby, a white population who don't move, and there's a genetic isolated group. So the risk is, so we need to develop a kind of communication strategies or culturally sensitive approaches to go back and say, look, these findings are important. This is important that if there are, for example, I don't know if there are any Asians, Pakistani on this in audience as well, that, for example, there are two caste groups. If you are marrying together, there is increased risk. So that is one aspect, that diversity in the staff as well, in more investment in those plan and program, developing communication strategies to going back and giving something to community as well, that this is the finding, not just to developing clinical and scientific project on that. Same as we have done the research on primary ciliary dyskinesia. That's another recessive genetic condition, more common in Pakistani population, very heterogeneous condition. So it's not a single gene that causes that. There are multiple genes involved. And the incidence of cystic fibrosis is same as, the incidence of PCD is same as the incidence of cystic fibrosis in Northern European. So there's just but again, we struggling to develop a simple test, a population screening test, which we could go back, and if they are still planning to marry within the family, at least there is something which can identify who is at risk. Mm-hmm. Same goes with the Black Afro-Caribbean population as well, that we know with multiple studies that men are slightly higher risk of prostate cancer. And in the UK, in certain pocket of, we are offering some screening, but that is only because the oncologists, the urologists, and the geneticists are very keen to develop those services for the Black African population, but that's not reflected in all the other clinical practice as well. Mm-hmm. So that's, again, the data is there. The unique clinical or scientific insight is there, but mm-hmm. What are the practical steps that we're translating that data into clinical practice and offering something back to communities?
Thank you, Shegun. I think that's a really important point, because the question was, why is it important scientifically, morally and ethically, even though when I spoke to Catherine Littler at the World Health Organization, she said, Kate, those two words mean the same thing, morally and ethically. I was like, never mind. But scientifically, morally and ethically to improve diversity. And in part, that's driven by the data. And it is about, I know that in Thailand, this is my third time of trying to encourage MANOP to get involved, but in terms of the work that they did when they started doing the analysis of the data, the variants were completely different. And this must be, resonating with Shegun's research about kind of, good old man up. I will come to you in a minute. Now, we've got only 19 minutes left, so I would encourage you all not to end this session and think, oh, I wish I'd asked that question. Now is your chance. But before I ramble on and try and misrepresent what Thailand's been doing, Saeed, we'll come to you, and then Manop, well done, we'll come to you. But yes, please do share your thoughts through the chat. And I've seen that Kai has asked a very interesting question. I'm not sure we're going to get onto that one. You might have to save it for Wednesday. But Dr. Saeed.
Thank you very much, Kate. So I'm not bringing anything new. I'll just wrap up and confirm of what my colleagues have just stressed, which is the importance of the private sector in all of this. So we're here to discuss how important diversity it is. We all agree that it is important and everyone should do more. But realistically, we all know that eventually the best bet would be on the private sector to make this doable in different parts of this world. If you look at the national genome projects, those who are public funded projects, and see what would motivate them most to basically launch these very expensive programs, or basically then try to contribute to others beyond their jurisdiction, as you say, Kate. Some of them launched it because they want they believe they have enough money to put that into the way of other scientists who keep telling them that this is the future of medicine. Others are there just to base or want to keep the lead. Others, as I said, have the right infrastructure and the right talent there. But what would convince those publicly funded projects to go and use those extra resources to basically for diversity? We've done it, and a lot of the projects here did it actually, but eventually it's going to be the private sector who will do it, and because they have a stake. It's terrible for me to say that, it's money, but that is a good drive to basically help in that. So the point is here now, this trust, this bridging of that trust, and I'm really glad that people like the PPP here are basically addressing that. You have to bridge those gaps and build those trusts. It's if there is mistrust in the developed world, it's a huge story. It's way beyond that in the third world, because we don't have this culture. And I speak of experience in Qatar. We've never had a pharmaceutical company accessing or producing data to develop a drug or a test. We don't have it. So the mistrust is even greater, and there's plenty to do from agencies and people like you, Kate, to basically come up with, well, first brainstorm till you find some sort of a global consensus of how to approach that and build trust and make it more acceptable for those countries and those places to accept basically safely the contribution of the private sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry, when you say we don't have it, is that you don't allow it, or no one's asked you?
Actually, it didn't happen as far as I know, and we've been during the past 3-4 years we've been because we've been approached by the industry. So when we went back for reference, we didn't see an example, we didn't see any guidelines, we didn't see any. So we are now developing those frameworks through which we can interact. Mm-hmm. With and we are just been giving you a headache from 2 hours ago, telling you that we are the largest in the region and all that, but we don't have that. We don't have the framework to basically interact with the industry or the private sector. So we're proactively developing this.
No, I mean, it's really interesting, because I think we know from the discussions, that representatives from H3 Africa meet with industry participants, and one of their questions is, what are you going to give me? And sometimes apparently the pharmaceutical companies are, what do you mean? But to me, what's bewildering is that everyone begins at the beginning. I find that, anyway, that's a conversation for another time. Manop, your thoughts from Thailand would be tremendous.
Hi, Kate. I'm sorry. I didn't respond earlier because I thought we were going to save this issue on Thursday. So, but happy to share my idea. I think it's several interesting perspective has been discussed earlier about the economic impacts and how to evaluate it, and also the perspective on lower or middle income countries. I think what I can give the example is on my viewpoint on national program like Genomics Thailand, which is launched it a year or more than a year ago. But I think Thailand have probably some a unique situation, also a good timing in terms of launching this program. We do see Genomics England as our model, that we're going to go to that direction because there's some similarity between Thailand and England. For example, we do have a national health system for reimbursement similar to NHS. We are focusing only on diagnostic sites. Just want to make sure that we can implement this in healthcare and demonstrate the benefit through a medical service rather than on economic front only. And also Thailand have one of the industrial segment, which is probably one of the biggest in this area of the world, is medical tourism. We do have a private sector, private hospital system that they are well renowned in terms of providing medical services, sophisticated testing, and also complicated disease that is probably one of the destinations that a lot of people would come for the treatment, and they are in need of this new technology. At the same time, I think at that point of bringing this idea on national genome program is at the time that we did have 3 ministers who are involving in healthcare and also higher educations. They are from science community. Yeah, 2 of them are physicians and 1 is pharmacist. So they understand the impact on and importance on this. So that's why we create this national program. I agree that being in a lower or middle income country, launching this sophisticated technology are pricey. And also, people say all the time, should we send out outsourcing on this service? We don't need this domestically. It's a lot of money to invest. It's going to be expensive compared to Western countries. But if we don't start it, we're not going to have it. We understand that sooner or later this cost will come down, and people would rather have the benefit right away than just wait. And we see that the importance of this on impact by helping the patients. Selling the idea on economic benefit would be very difficult for policymakers who rarely understand the science and also the new technology. But I think there are ways to persuade them. I believe, for example, if we choose to demonstrate the benefit on something that they really understand, for example, helping healthcare industries, combating well-known disease like cancer or adverse drug reaction, pharmacogenomics would be easier sell compared to rare diseases that we know that have a great benefit on genome technology. But it's going to be difficult to sell for policymakers who don't really understand what it means. So that's why we are trying to balance on science, on the healthcare sector, and also on the economic impact. This is from just my perspective on a Thailand Genome Program, who probably would at least give an example on the lower middle income country perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Manop. I mean, I'm not going to repeat what you've said because you covered a lot in there. And certainly I think that we're very much looking forward to your contribution on Thursday, looking at these issues in a little bit more detail, because I think it is important. Unless there is a way to articulate economic benefits of participating in genomics, I just fear that policymakers are just potentially just look at it as luxurious, and that kind of misses the point. I think you've made this point before, and it really resonated then, it resonates now, that you've got to start collecting data, and what the whys and wherefores of that, I think, is quite interesting in the case of Thailand. Conscious of time, see, we're just having such fun. We're nearly out of 2 hours. Anamika, I'd like to come to you. You've been raising some really important points through the chat all morning. And then Chantal, you've raised a really important point about workforce, which I think is really, really interesting. So I'd like first, if I may, to call on Anamika and then Chantal, if you are still here.
Hi, Kate. Yes, so I think my question was quite a long one on the chat, but I think what I wanted to put forward is, sorry about that. I wanted to put forward the discussion of ethical, legal, and social issues, which is such an important topic when it comes to genomic data sharing. But from my opinion or my understanding, we generally focus on the legal issues. And these are important questions that we should be asking, is what are the ethical issues besides that are addressed by GDPR or other equivalents across other countries? What are the social issues, and how can we find out these important questions as well? So I would think that's probably a research question in itself, but it's still very important to discuss at forums like this. That's one point I wanted to raise. And then the other one was, of course, on the us versus them. That's again on Yevande's point, is co-creation from the start. And how can we minimize this divide between us versus them, or not versus, but us and them, where there's a science discourse and then there's a society discourse. Yeah, those are the points that I wanted to raise.
Thank you, Anamika. And I think this idea of where do you begin the conversation is really quite interesting. And I think that's where PPP's found itself in this sort of intersection between all sorts of other issues. Because we don't lead with the science or technology of genomics, there are other far better qualified fora for that. We're not about the standardization of data in genomics, that's GA4GH. It's not just about kind of the medical application of genomics with G2MC and all of their work. Ours is sort of slightly different, and this bringing together of these different elements. I mean, I think it's important. I mean, looking at the work on the 1 million plus genomes project, you're having to sort of harmonize 27 jurisdictions around GDPR. Good luck with that. But that's why our work can't come up with specific actionable policy recommendations for every jurisdiction in the world, because it's too difficult and it's impossible and it's impractical. That's why our work comes up with our series of recommendations based on the insights. And you look at the first recommendation, or the first global insight that we made in our report, which was that a global charter for genomics needs to be established and enforced, which addresses issues of equity of access and return in global genomics. That's picking up a huge heap of these issues. It's just like not that quite straightforward, but we need to think about how we're going to do it. And therefore our work is about collating evidence that can help inform those policymaking decisions. I'm relatively confident PPP is not the right organization to write a global charter to which everyone signs up, but we need to start having the conversation that someone needs to do that. And who it is a slightly different point. And Chantal, you raised this point about increasing resources and capacity to do the work where diverse populations are. And I think this is really important, But it's not, again, if we come back to it, this is not just an issue about low and middle income countries. We need to do better in all of our jurisdictions. We need to have better representation. And Mavis and Sagira and, you know, Sasha and Kai are contributing to a panel discussion on Wednesday. And, you know, Sasha would have said, you know, I'm used to being the only one in the room. You know, this is just like, well, how do we address some of these challenges? So I don't know, Chantal, if you're still here, whether you wanted to just pick up on that. And then I think, sadly, we're going to have to wrap up.
Yeah, so yeah, no, it's exactly what you said. It's just having that representation within these other populations that could then lead to facilitation of co-creation and creating those environments where you've kind of created that trust already with people who are within the communities themselves, that really would allow for co-creation and understanding of what is possible within those communities to actually do that work. And you're absolutely right. It's not just about other countries. It's also within our own country and with our own communities on creating a better understanding on what genomics can provide and how genomics can contribute to their own health and their own care. Yes, so thank you very much for this very interesting debate today.
Thank you, Chantal. And I think if we just sort of, before we wrap up, pause and reflect on why we wanted to do this webinar today. To me, there are so many different perspectives about what we even mean by diversity. And I'm really pleased to have had such a great participation from everybody today. And I really hope that you'll, you know, join us for our session tomorrow, which is going to look at the use of technology to address science and equity in global genomics. That's going to be chaired by Peter Goodhand, who's the Chief Executive of the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. We will be joined by Dr. Roland Illing at Amazon Web Services. We've got Mahesh Pancholi from the UK Biobank. We've got Maria Chatsu, who's the Chief Executive of LifeBit. We've got Tonya from Oxford Nanopore Technologies. You know, and we've also got Professor Alan Christoffels, who leads the bioinformatics for H3 Africa. And I think that is going to pick up on a lot of these more specific points around the role of technology, you know, democratization of access to data, the role of the cloud, better and different sequencing techniques. So I would encourage you to join us then. But to me, this is such an important issue and it can get caught up in all sorts of little areas. To me, it's very important that we have this sort of more expansive conversation. And I hope that you didn't think that's 2 hours of your life you're not going to get back. I really hope that you got something out of it. Certainly in terms of, you know, from our perspective at PPP, I think it's been very helpful in terms of helping us focus on what we may look to do in terms of future programs. But I wanted to extend my thanks once again to Maxine, to Katalina, to Shegun and to Saeed, to everyone who's contributed through the chat function. And if you have any further questions or you are interested in some of the wider work that we're doing, then please just do get in touch. And I hope to see as many of you as possible tomorrow. But until then, we're finishing 1 minute early. Until then, thank you so much for your contribution today. It's been a fascinating discussion and I really appreciate your insights and your thoughts. Thank you so much.